the right spot.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome to the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee meeting for May 10th, 2023. Our trivia today in honor of Representative Jake Fye, who's sitting in front of us, who starts his committee meetings with trivia, is name the band and additional song lyrics for Welcome Back, My Friends, to the Show That Never Ends.
Can I call a friend?
Well, anyone can join in, and it is not a quiz for you. I'm just
I love it. No,
a question in honor of you. Senator Mullet has the answer. Oh, Senator Lovelit has the answer.
You sound like you're singing a theme song to Lamb Chop's Play Along, but I think you didn't get far enough in the lyrics to distinguish.
Well, Emerson, Lake and Palmer All right. We have a hybrid meeting today, and
So glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside. Sorry. Your song got me singing.
Well, better you than me. Since I am known for having been told to stop singing in our caucus room by my seatmate, who actually sang in a choir and said that I ruined Happy Birthday.
Everybody does that.
It's true confession time. With that, we will now, let's start with the roll, please. And that is not a drum roll, but just a roll call, please, of who's present.
Thank you. This is a roll call for the attendance at the May 10th, 2023 JLARC meeting. Representative Berg. Representative Fye.
Present.
Representative Gaynor. Senator Hasagawa. Senator Lovelet.
Here.
Senator Mullet.
Here.
Representative Orcutt.
Here.
Representative Paulette.
Here.
Senator Rivers. Senator Saldana. Senator Short. Representative Stokesbury.
Here.
Senator Wagner.
Wagoner is present.
Senator Wilson.
I am here.
We
We have 8 in attendance, so we do have a quorum.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So today, as per normal, let me just remind people to please raise your hand on Zoom. And I would ask, if I don't see it right away, for Representative Orcutt as executive committee member sitting next to me, if you see something, or Legislative Auditor Thomas, if you see someone raise their hand, please let me know. And we have a very packed agenda. We will be introducing JLARC's new staff. We will have a couple of action items on meeting minutes, and then the review of the Statewide Reentry Council proposed final report is in front of us, which is an action item after we hear, and we have Department of Commerce and co-chair of the Statewide Reentry Council and the executive director available to answer questions. That will be followed by item 3 on the agenda, which is the racial equity effects of restricting in-person education during COVID-19. And after we hear the proposed final report from JLARC staff, we do have 2 representatives from the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction to answer questions, and then we will have a motion in order to approve distribution of the report. I want to remind people who may not be familiar with our operations that the committee receives the reports of the legislative auditor, and our role is to approve the report for distribution and adopt any comments if comments were submitted in advance and people have had a chance to review them. We do not have any comments submitted on the 3 proposed reports that are in front of us today. And the third report today is the report on hybrid electric ferries and design, build, contracting, procurement. And with that report, after the staff reports, we will have the opportunity to ask questions from State Department of Transportation. we have a review at the end of the agenda of proposed study questions for the H-2A farm worker program and paid family medical leave programs. Are there any questions about our agenda? Okay. In that case, I believe our first item is Legislative Auditor Thomas. Would you please introduce our new staff?
Thank you, Representative Paulette. I'm pleased to announce that we have 4 new staff and 1 staff, continuing on in a new position. I'm pleased to announce that Zane Kelly is rejoined JLARC as a research analyst. Jared Gunnell is helping us out as our new committee assistant. And we have 2 research analyst interns, Andrew Hatt and Hannah Norze. And finally, Stephanie Hoffman, who's worked as a research analyst, will be taking on a role as an audit coordinator and will be taking lead on the tax preferences and other reports throughout the coming years. So, thank you all.
And welcome to our new staff, and congratulations to Stephanie. Appreciate that we've got, I think it's well recognized that we have the strongest legislative auditor staff in the nation, and glad to have additions to the team and the continuity and for our expertise. And with that, let's move to the first action item is, can I have a motion to approve the JLARC meeting minutes? Secretary Orcutt, would you please make the motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we approve the minutes from the January 4th, 2023 JLARC meeting.
Second? Representative Fye is seconded. Any discussion? Not seeing any discussion. Please vote if you're online by saying your name and aye or nay. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye, Wagoner.
Any nays, please indicate. Any abstentions? For the record, the minutes of January 4th are adopted unanimously. Representative Orcutt, would you like to move February 16th?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we adopt the committee meeting minutes from February 16th, 2023.
And
Second.
has been seconded. Thank you. Any discussion of the February 16th meeting minutes? Not seeing any discussion, we will move to a vote. All in favor of adoption, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Aye. Would I?
Are there any nays? Please say. Not hearing any nays. Any abstentions? Minutes for February 16th are adopted unanimously. Thank you all very much. And let me thank the members who are present again, very much so, for making sure we have a quorum. Really, we have some really important audits in front of us today, and during session, it was hard to gather us together. It was kind of lonely sitting up here for a meeting or two when we were in the middle of floor action, and it was hard to gather us. So thank you to the members for being present and participating today. With that, we're going to start with the first item, and which is the proposed final report on the review of the Washington Statewide Reentry Council. We have Amanda Edrick and Ashley Trunnell from the JLARC staff who are presenting. And what I'd like to do with each of these is ask people to, if you have a question about a slide or statement, that is right in front of us, go ahead and raise your hand if it's a clarifying question. If it's a big picture question or involves agency response or something big picture, of course, I'll ask for questions and comments after the presentation. So let's try to do that. And Amanda and Ashley, would you like to take it away, please? We need your mic on.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm Amanda Edrick, and I'm joined by my colleague, Ashley Trinnell. And we are staff of the committee. Today, we are here to present the proposed final report for a review of the Washington Statewide Reentry Council. Reentry is the transition from incarceration back into the community. As a reminder, in January, we presented the preliminary report, and this will be an abbreviated version of that report. The legislative auditor has concluded that the council has performed most of its statutory duties. However, without a strategy or measurable goals, the focus of its efforts is unclear and the impact cannot be evaluated. The legislature directed JLARC to review the council every 6 years, and this is the first review. The next review will be in 2028. The Reentry Council has 15 volunteer members appointed by the governor, 2 staff members, which are an executive director and a council coordinator. And the Department of Commerce supports the Reentry Council by providing facilities and other administrative services. The legislative auditor made 2 recommendations for the council. The first is for the council to develop a stakeholder engagement plan that will ensure they are engaging all stakeholders in statute. The second recommendation is for the council to develop a strategic plan with performance measures and benchmarks. The plan should guide the council's activities, recommendations, and spending. The Department of Commerce and the Reentry Council concur with these recommendations, and OFM had no comment on the report. The 2016 legislature created the Statewide Reentry Council to develop collaborative and cooperative relationships with stakeholders to improve public safety and improve outcomes for people reentering the community after incarceration. The council does not operate any reentry programs. During our review, we found the Reentry Council performed most of its required functions. The council has held 4 public meetings per year, issued 3 biannual reports that include policy recommendations and summarize the council's activities, and consulted with some stakeholder groups, but not all the groups specified in statute. The council has performed additional duties allowed in statute, such as hiring an executive director and coordinator. And between the fiscal years of 2017 and 2022, the council spent $1.27 million primarily on staff and grants to nonprofits. Statute requires the Reentry Council to consult with 12 additional stakeholder groups. This is a separate requirement from the groups represented in council membership. The council has had limited interaction engagement with most of these stakeholder groups, and the frequency and type of engagement varies. We found the council has frequent engagement with individuals who have experienced reentry, the Department of Corrections, and the governor's office. After talking with stakeholders and reviewing administrative records, we saw less engagement with other stakeholder groups. For example, the Reentry Council relies on its own membership to fulfill the statutory outreach requirement to education and jails. The Reentry Council was not able to provide evidence of working with specialty courts, managed care organizations, or behavioral health administrative service organizations. And now I'll turn it over to Ashley to talk about strategic planning.
Thanks, Amanda. The legislature expected that JLARC's evaluation would be informed by the council's own objectives and benchmarks or performance measures. The Reentry Council has discussed the need for these measures but has not adopted them. Without measures, it's unclear whether the council's activities have affected public safety or reentry outcomes, which is the Reentry Council's intent and statute. We also found that the Reentry Council has discussed the need to create a strategic plan, but has not done so. Without a plan, there is an unclear focus for the council's activities and policy recommendations. There is a list of strategic priorities in the council's 2020 biennial report, but these priorities do not include the elements suggested in best practices for strategic planning, such as identifying goals with activities and performance measures. Also, these priorities were not adopted or discussed at a council meeting. The council has adopted a racial equity statement, but without a strategic plan, it's unclear how racial equity will inform the Reentry Council's activities, like engaging with stakeholders, creating policy recommendations, or issuing grants. As Amanda mentioned, the legislative auditor has two recommendations. First, the council should develop a stakeholder engagement plan that will demonstrate how it will solicit input and participation from all of the stakeholders identified in statute. The council should also develop a strategic plan to guide its activities, recommendations, and spending. The plan should have performance benchmarks and measures so the council can track its progress toward its goals. The Department of Commerce and the Reentry Council concur with these recommendations, and OFM had no comment. You can view our full report and other report materials on our website. This slide has the contact information of the study team, and that concludes our remarks. We're happy to answer any questions, and there are also representatives from the statewide Reentry Council here to answer questions as well.
Let's start with any questions for our staff, and then I will call up the Reentry Council and Department of Commerce to answer additional questions. Any staff questions for staff? Well, I have one. If no one else is going to ask, I'll jump to the head of the line here. When I looked at the report, one of the things that popped into my head is, and this is a question I'll please for the Reentry Council and Department of Commerce to respond to as well when you come up. Are the resources there for the Reentry Council to have facilitator or skilled support to develop a strategic plan with input from stakeholders?
Yes, the council can certainly comment on that, but they are working with a consultant right now to develop a strategic plan, and how they figured out those funds, I'm not exactly sure, but that is in process right now.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from anyone? Okay, I'd like to ask then, thank you very much, Ashley and Amanda, for your work and really important review. I'd like to ask Janelle McPhee, Brittany Lovely, and Winona Stevens, if you're here or online. I don't know if have them online. Yes. Okay. Let's start with, would you each introduce yourselves, and then do you have any opening comments you'd like to share?
Sure, absolutely. I'll start. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the members of the committee. I know this might be odd, but I'm excited to be here today. I'm excited to start this process. I will say I've only been in this position for 4 months. And so today I just wanted to take a couple minutes to address the JLARC recommendations after we do our introductions and what we've managed to accomplish since I've been in the position with an amazing Reentry Council and also our council coordinator, Brittany Lovely, who is on the call today. And I also believe Winona Stevens, our co-chair, is here as well. So I'll let them.
Would you introduce yourself?
Oh. I'm sorry. So, so my name is Janelle McFeet. I'm the new executive director of the Washington Statewide Reentry Council, and I was hired in January. So, a lot of this information I'm taking in and working really hard in order to look at those recommendations from JLARC and get those completed.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Winona Stevens. I represent tribal interests on the council. I'm a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin, and I am one of the 3 co-chairs. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll jump in there. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. Brittany Lovely. I have been support staff to the council for about 3 years now. So I've got to work under our former executive director, Christopher Poulos, and then in his interim, and now with Janelle McPhee. So happy to be here and answer any questions you'll have.
Thank you. So any opening thoughts on behalf of the council to the audit and report and recommendations?
Certainly, and I'll go ahead and jump in. So as Amanda mentioned, we contracted with the Athena Group to work on the strategic plan. So, and I have a few notes here. So right now we're currently working collaboratively to develop that strategic plan with, and including recommendations and spending. We formed a subcommittee, we formed a project team, key structures and inclusive processes that will ultimately create the strategic plan. And this has included doing some preliminary data analysis to understand the prior work of the council and its historical causes and priorities, drafting a strategic framework summary and an initial logic model as well. And also drafting, which is very important, that drafting a stakeholder engagement plan to identify key stakeholders, partners, and demonstrates how we'll solicit input and participation from those stakeholders. And so currently, and this has been a lot of work, I won't lie, we would like to have this done by June 30th, so we are really working hard to get this accomplished. And currently, we're engaging in key stakeholder activities to ensure our community voices are included and considered in the drafting of the council strategic plan. So this includes surveys, and we have sent those out to both council members and all the stakeholders with our expansive listserv. We've also held a focus groups for both our Indigenous community, and I was a part of that, as well as a cross-section of our key stakeholder groups. And most importantly, those that are currently sitting behind bars and putting together listening circles for that to get feedback. And so next, what we're planning on doing is reviewing all of that information provided by our stakeholders and partners to inform and ultimately draft the council's strategic plan that will have a clear vision, mission, goals, strategic objectives, activities, and performance benchmarks that ultimately clarify how the council's activities have affected public safety and reentry outcomes. So this will include recommendations for continuous stakeholder engagement and performance evaluations to monitor progress. So we have done a lot of work to address those recommendations, and obviously, if you have any questions, or if Brittany and Winona would like to chime in, not just are we addressing that, but there's also some big rocks that we would like to highlight today as well. I know we only have probably 1 more minute or 2 minutes, but yeah, I don't know if Brittany and Winona have anything to add to that piece. All good?
Well, if there are a couple of things you'd like to highlight, we have a question from Senator Wagner, and then.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you and welcome to the team, Janelle.
Thank you.
I like that you are talking about expanding stakeholders. And one of the slides we saw there, it looked like the interactions were kind of heavily weighted towards Department of Corrections and the governor's office. And that's kind of one in the same because the Secretary of Corrections is appointed by the governor. How are you figuring out who stakeholders are? Because that's a hard thing. As soon as you think you've got all the stakeholders, you find out that you have missed somebody important.
Sure.
Does that list on the second slide with behavioral health professionals and other professionals, is that something that's going to help guide your reach to encapsulate all the stakeholders?
Sure. And so since this is just the beginning process, that's a great question. So Sue Mason, who has been brought on to work with the Athena Group, is taking on kind of that weight of that stakeholder engagement. And so our core team, we have put together a extensive list of 4 focus groups, including up to over 60 individuals. And that is a wide range to include, because I saw that in the report, to include that behavioral health piece. And we know, my expertise lies in reentry. And so as I move into this executive director position, trying to figure out what that looks like. And so definitely we have a wide range of stakeholders that will be, actually tomorrow night, we're in a focus group, and we have 3 more focus groups. We ran a tribal focus group as well. But to make sure that we're including all voices. And if we can't get all of those voices in the focus groups, we've sent out surveys. So in my opinion, we have a really good group of people that can provide that feedback.
Mr. Chair, may I follow up?
Yes.
It's just really important not to have an echo chamber, and I would ask that you consider victims of crimes or their families as part of that group. Thank you for the answer.
Yes, and we do have that. Thank you.
Brittany, go ahead.
Looks like Winona's got her hand up.
I'm sorry. Winona, not Brittany. Sorry. Please go ahead.
Oh, no worries. Thank you. Thank you for your question, Senator Wagner. I just wanted to take a moment to point out, over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of change on the council. We've had a change in our executive director, and we've had, over a period of time, a number of positions that haven't been filled. One of our new positions is the Heather Weir, who is the appointee to represent the interests of crime victims. And I think one of the reasons why I appreciate the JLARC report in time coming to us at a time when we're also working on our strategic planning session is that right now we have a full council. And, over the period, changes in co-chairs, changes in executive director, empty spaces on the council, I feel like right now is the best time to address the stakeholder question, because with a full council representing such a wide variety of interests across our membership, we're going to get a clearer picture of who those stakeholders are from each of our separate reasons why we were appointed to the council. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Do the council representatives have anything else they'd like to add for us? In that case, are there any comments, or not just questions, but any comments from committee members? Representative Orcutt?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move that we approve for distribution the Statewide Reentry Council proposed final report.
We have a motion and a second for approval of the report for distribution. Is there any further discussion on the motion? I would just like to say I'm very heartened by the enthusiastic response from the council on the strategic planning and and the ambitious schedule you've got. And I think that it's very heartening, and look forward to hearing the results, and ask that you make sure that you share the strategic plan with through the legislative auditor's staff to send out to committee members, as well as to each of the legislative committees that are relevant, and there are several. So with that, I'd like to ask all in favor of the motion to approve for the report for distribution, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
If you do not wish to vote to approve, please say nay. There are no nays. Any abstentions? There are no abstentions. The report is approved for distribution, and I want to thank the staff and the Reentry Council and Department of Commerce staff for sharing with us and responding. That brings us to item number 3 on our agenda, which is the racial equity effects of restricting in-person education during COVID-19. We have 3 JLARC staff who are presenting today. I ask you each to introduce yourselves, and afterwards we have 2 folks from Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction available. And again, just ask if you have questions about a particular slide or statement, please raise your hand or turn around if you're in the room and let me know. And hold the big questions, big comments for after the presentation. Okay, please introduce yourselves and take it away.
Good morning, Chair Paulette and members of the committee. I'm Stephanie Seto, and I'm joined by my colleagues Erin Cavan and Joshua Karras. We're staff to the committee. We're here to present the proposed final report on racial equity effects of restricting in-person education during the COVID-19 pandemic. The legislative auditor concluded that racial disparities in student assessment scores increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in higher poverty schools. The Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, or OSPI, does not yet have a process to monitor the effectiveness of federally funded interventions to promote learning recovery. And we presented the preliminary report to you in January of this year, and so what you're hearing today is an abbreviated version of that presentation. The legislative auditor had 2 recommendations. The first, OSPI should finish collecting more detailed race and ethnicity data for all students in accordance with 2016 state legislation. OSPI concurs with this recommendation. And the second recommendation, OSPI should establish a process to monitor school districts' implementation of their academic and student well-being recovery plans in accordance with 2021 state legislation. And OSPI partially concurs. The Office of Financial Management had no comment on this report. In June of 2021, you asked us to analyze how restrictions to in-person education affected educational opportunities and academic outcomes for students of different races and ethnicities. So just as a reminder, in March of 2020, Governor Inslee issued a proclamation restricting in-person education due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So instead of in-person instruction, districts provided remote instruction to their students. Districts began reopening their school buildings in the 2020-21 school year in accordance with state and local public health rules. And by April of 2021, districts were required to offer some in-person instruction. Our analysis is based on federal race and ethnicity categories OSPI is required to use when reporting to the U.S. Department of Education. And for your reference, the categories are listed here on the slide. In 2016, the legislature directed OSPI to collect more detailed student race and ethnicity information. So, for example, OSPI was required to expand the Asian category to differentiate Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, and other subracial and subethnic identities. OSPI expected this data to be collected over several years, with districts phasing in this data collection process over time. When JLARC staff began this review in 2021, OSPI had detailed race and ethnicity data for 18% of Washington students. By June of 2022, OSPI had this data for 63% of Washington students. Until OSPI completes this data collection, more detail about disparities in education for subracial and subethnic groups will not be available. And this leads us to the first legislative auditor recommendation. OSPI should finish collecting more detailed race and ethnicity data for all students in accordance with 2016 state legislation. OSPI concurs, and OFM had no comment.
I will now discuss how the pandemic affected the mode in which students learned and changes in assessment scores. During the 2020 to 21 school year, OSPI did not collect student-level instruction mode data. They surveyed each school district about which instruction mode they were using for their elementary, middle, and high schools. We estimated the mode in which each student learned using this district survey, and we aggregated OSPI's data into three main categories: remote, in-person, and hybrid instruction. Remote instruction is when schools offered all instruction outside of a school facility. In-person is when schools offered all of their instruction within a classroom or some other school facility. And hybrid is when schools offered a combination of remote and in-person instruction. This includes offering in-person to some grades and remote to others, or offering all students a combination of remote and in-person. Our analysis found that most students during the 2020 to 21 school year were offered hybrid instruction. Our analysis found that students of different races and ethnicities returned to in-person instruction at different rates. By the end of the 2020 to 21 school year, 19% of students were located in schools that offered in-person instruction. This compares to the roughly 24% of white students that were offered in-person instruction, compared to the 3% of Asian students that were located in schools that were offering in-person instruction. For this study, staff analyzed student-level standardized assessment scores dating back to 2017. In Washington, students take the Smarter Balanced Assessment, which evaluates students' math and English skills. Students in 3rd through 8th grade and 10th grade take these assessments. The test that was supposed to be administered in spring 2020 was canceled, and the spring 2021 test was postponed until fall of the next school year. Our analysis found that math and English scores declined for students of all races and ethnicities. Prior to the pandemic, there were pre-existing disparities in math scores. Average assessment scores declined for all racial and ethnic groups. From 2019 to 2021, Asian students had the smallest average decrease in math scores at 5.8%, whereas Native Hawaiian students had the largest average decrease, 11.5%. In spring 2022, average assessment scores increased for all racial and ethnic groups, but none have recovered to their pre-pandemic averages. In English, pre-existing disparities existed prior to the pandemic. And again, average assessment scores declined for all racial and ethnic groups. From 2019 to 2021, Asian students had the smallest average decrease, 1.1%, and Native Hawaiian students had the largest average decrease at 5.1%. Again, average assessment scores have remained down from spring 2019. Math and English scores have decreased for students of all racial and ethnic groups across both assessments, and some groups had larger decreases than others, and as a result, there were racial disparities in assessment scores that increased. We worked with the Social Development Research Group at the University of Washington to conduct a survey of Washington teachers about the effects of the pandemic. We received responses from 6,692 teachers from 1,475 schools in 228 school districts. Respondents noted many challenges during teaching during the 2020 to 21 school year, including covering less than normal curriculum. Additional serious problems described by many teachers included students missing class, students not completing their homework, lower class participation, and increased student apathy. Additional information and summaries of teachers' responses are available in Appendix B of our report.
So, as we have described, there were racial disparities in students' access to in-person instruction, and assessment scores declined. To address the effects of the pandemic, OSPI received $2.9 billion in federal elementary and secondary school emergency relief, or ESSER funds. Under federal law, 90% of these funds must be passed on to school districts, and the funds can be used for a wide variety of activities, including sanitation and materials that were necessary to reopen safely during the pandemic. Districts must spend at least $334 million of these funds to promote learning recovery and address learning loss, or the academic impact of lost instructional time due to school closures. These funds must also address the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on certain student groups, such as students from historically disadvantaged racial or ethnic groups. To receive the full amount of funding, districts were required by state and federal law to submit academic and student well-being recovery plans to OSPI in 2021. The plans explain how districts intend to use emergency funding to address student needs resulting from school building closures and remote learning. Districts identified specific interventions that they would use, including social and emotional learning and mental health supports, summer school, additional instructional time, high-quality tutoring, and many others. The plans explain how these interventions will assist students who are disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, such as students from certain racial or ethnic groups. The 2021 legislature directed schools to report their progress implementing their academic and student well-being recovery plans to OSPI. As of October 2022, OSPI had not identified a way for schools or school districts to report their progress. It is unknown if districts have implemented the interventions in their plans or what effects those interventions may have had. And without monitoring districts' progress, there is limited information available about whether districts are achieving their learning recovery goals or whether interventions are helping students who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Information on what interventions were implemented and what effects they have had could be used to target remaining learning recovery funds. In OSPI's plan for ESSER funding, which is submitted to the U.S. Department of Education, OSPI committed to assisting districts with performance measurement and outcome monitoring as part of a 3-phase continuous improvement process in which districts could implement their plans, see what works, and revise their plans accordingly. The legislative auditor recommends that OSPI establish a process to monitor school districts' implementation of their academic and student well-being recovery plans in accordance with 2021 state legislation. OSPI partially concurs, stating that multiple systems already exist for reporting school expenditures, school progress, and outcomes, and that OSPI will add additional monitoring if required by the U.S. Department of Education. OFM had no comment. The legislative auditor had a comment on OSPI's response, reiterating that OSPI has not established a process for school districts to report their progress implementing their plans as requested in state legislation. This limits OSPI's ability to help districts adapt their learning recovery strategies and interventions as anticipated in OSPI's plan for ESSER funding. And implementing the recommendation will position OSPI to respond to expected federal requirements. The U.S. Department of Education has published guidance stating that state education agencies will be required to report additional information about what interventions districts are implementing to promote learning recovery for students disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, such as how many students from different racial groups participated in ESSER-funded tutoring programs, for example. In summary, students' access to in-person instruction varied by race and ethnicity. Assessment scores decreased for all racial and ethnic groups, with larger decreases for some groups. OSPI and districts received $2.9 billion in federal funds to address pandemic effects, and some of these funds must be used to address the academic impacts of school closures, including racially disparate impacts. And OSPI has not yet established a process to monitor recovery plan implementation, which the legislature requested in 2021. This concludes our report. The full report is available online, along with interactive data about assessment scores and a summary of teacher survey results. Our contact information is available here. We're happy to answer any questions, and representatives from OSPI are here as well. Thanks.
Thank you. This is a report that goes to our paramount duty as a legislature, and really appreciate the thoroughness and the work and the follow-up to OSPI's response. And let's start with Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wanted to start with page 2, and number 2, what OSPI should do, and they only partially concurred with number 2. What did they concur with in that portion?
Well, representatives from OSPI are here as well, and I think they'd be best prepared to speak to their position on the recommendation.
Okay, I have a follow-up on another portion, if that's okay.
Yes, it is, and we'll come back to OSPI. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think it's page 11, 12. They talk about the ESSER funds, $2.9 billion, and 10% of that. Where does the other 10% go? What are they doing with that 10%? And which is like $290 million. $334 million we're supposed to go into learning loss. So how many schools, because this 90% of this money, $2.6 billion then, would be given to the schools? Was that evenly distributed? Was it all distributed? Do we have a list of schools that did get the funding?
Yes. So the 90% is in federal law that must be passed on directly to school districts. The other 10% goes to the state education agency, so OSPI. And then OSPI can use that for implementing recovery plans at the state level or through grants to educational service districts or in other programs. OSPI, I think, would be best prepared to answer what they're doing with that funding. For the $334 million for learning loss, basically this is a percentage outlined in federal law about how much money will go to schools or school districts for promoting learning recovery. And that information is available. I don't have the information about which school districts got which amount of money, but that's information that we'd be happy to provide.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look and see if there are any other hands. Let me ask you to jump to the findings and discussion in regard to reporting of activities by school districts. Could you expand a little bit? There's a discussion about the lack of clarity in terms of what districts are spending ESSER funds on recovery for. In particular, I found it disturbing in terms of essentially in other categories, 70%. And not surprising to members and people observing, I'm very interested when I looked at this, as I had been previously when we presented the preliminary report, in whether or not we are able to look at whether or not districts made commitments or performance efforts in terms of not just recovery, but compensatory time for students with disabilities, which would require one to have, one would think, specific commitments, not just in other category. So can you talk about what that encompasses? How much of the funding was in that broad brush, and is there a way of knowing what is being spent or done, or any way to evaluate under that broad category?
Yeah, for sure. So there are two main ways that school districts are reporting their expenditures of this funding. And one of those ways has information at the kind of object and activity level, so saying this is money spent on teaching or money spent on maintenance or transportation or something like that. So that all that information is available, and we analyze that information. There's also an expenditure reporting system specifically for ESSER funding, and it's different for each round of ESSER funding. So for the one that's most germane to our study questions is about the learning recovery funding. And that one, there's kind of big categories in which districts can report their spending. So on one-time contracts for staff or for data systems, and then, like you mentioned, these other categories. And at the time that we concluded the report, it was about 74%, I believe, that had been reported in one of those other categories. So that's information that it's not possible to connect that to the interventions that were implemented. So we don't know specifically how much is spent on certain types of interventions. And then for the question about commitments for students with disabilities, that's not information that I have available at the moment, but we could look that up and try to get an answer for you.
Thank you, and ask OSPI to assist in doing that. So would it be fair to say that if you cannot assess what was being spent on specific activities for recovery, you can't assess the efficacy of those activities and in a statewide study?
I think the objective would be to have a sense of what was being spent on an intervention and what students received that intervention, and then to see how those students' assessment scores or some other metric of student performance changed after that intervention in order to measure the effectiveness of that intervention. Yes.
Thank you. Do committee members have other questions? Let's thank you very much for the work you've done and for your commitments and working with the legislature and everyone, all the stakeholders in terms of working through the comments and the preliminary report and feedback from us. Thank you. And let's ask, is OSPI present in the room? I think that you are. Come on up and introduce yourselves.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. I'm Deb Kame. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Assessment and Student Information.
And I'm Maria Flores. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for the Improvement of Student Learning, which is our research office.
Thank you both for being here. Would you like to share your response and comments to kick us off?
Certainly. The superintendent response was submitted in a letter, and I just want to emphasize a couple of things regarding the recommendations. First, I want to note that the public K-12 schools are the most accountable system within the education sector. There are multiple state and federal processes and reporting mechanisms in place to monitor and report on the expenditures and student outcomes. Also, the ESSER dollars were, as Congress was very intentional to make it clear, that the dollars were very flexible so that schools could quickly respond and adjust to the changing needs during the pandemic. Also, there are multiple progress monitoring systems that are in place and have been in place for tracking expenditures and student outcomes and student progress. That includes revenue and expenditure codes, a student data system for collecting characteristics, demographics, and outcomes, as well as the Washington State Report Card, the Washington School Improvement Framework, as well, and comprehensive program review that's required under the ESEA. OSPI will do any additional monitoring from the ESSER funds that are required by the U.S. Department of Education. Could be done via revised templates or additional guidance. And then last comment regarding the race and ethnicity data collection. It is complete as of this year, and districts are submitting under the more detailed codes. Do you want to add anything further?
No, just a couple. Excuse me, I'm looking at my notes real quick. Would it be better to ask for the members that just asked questions to repeat their questions, or I have answers for those as well?
I think you should just go ahead, and
Okay.
if they have further questions, we'll ask them.
Well, I would respond to your question about compensatory ed, and I do have a document that we can send after this meeting. OSPI was very intentional, so compensatory ed for students with disabilities is already a requirement under federal law. We also put out guidance about recovery services, and we distinguish this from compensatory ed because the recovery services were for lack of progress on specific individual learning goals in an IEP as a result of the pandemic. Compensatory ed is something that is always available to any parent and party to an IEP if those goals aren't being met or if there's been an issue in the implementation of the IEP. So we added additional support and guidance on both the already required federal compensatory ed and then this Washington-specific category of recovery services. Does that answer your question?
I was trying to avoid the jargon here because people get confused between recovery and compensatory. But bottom line is that thousands of parents with children with disabilities and IEPs did not receive any services for over a year, sometimes much more than a year. They, for example, might not have received any speech therapy. And the question that those parents keep coming forward is, where's the accountability for ensuring that their child will not have permanently lost a year of opportunity and just the fact that they are struggling to simply even meet IEPs that are in place and had many of them revised downward. So how do we track that and hold districts accountable to improve the delivery of those services to make up for time that, well, you can't make up. If a child with autism lost a year and a half of in-person education and regressed, they'll never make that up, of course. But how do we try to make sure that we are looking at what is being offered, ensuring that recovery is being offered, and what is effective? And that's just not for children with IEPs, but for example, saying we offered tutoring. Well, that doesn't mean a darn thing if you can't specify what type of tutoring for which population and allow us to assess the efficacy of those tutoring interventions.
Oh, I appreciate that. And if you'll allow me, I'll take a moment of personal privilege and say one of those students is my daughter. She's in the 5th year. Her IEP was very difficult to be followed during the pandemic. There are multiple reporting and accountability measures through IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, and we are looking through and monitoring that. I don't know because more of the specifics besides what I would like to follow up with our Dr. Tanya May, who's our assistant superintendent, because I don't want to guess on the details of those reporting mechanisms. But I think OSPI is very explicitly concerned with students with disabilities and our monitoring.
And we've partnered quite a bit this year to improve efforts, but on the broader scale, the response in writing to the report was, will improve delineation of reporting if the federal Department of Education requires it. I think our duty as legislature is to ask you to ensure that there is adequate reporting of what interventions were or are being utilized in order for you and for us as a legislature to assess the efficacy of those rather than saying we'll only do it if the Department of Education requires us to delineate further. Do you have any response to that concern?
No, I think that, again, what I would reiterate, and I think this was something that we shared both in the letter and at the first preliminary hearing, when we speak of interventions in a school setting, there are multiple fund sources and multiple inputs that affect the intervention. And I used the example before of multi-tiered systems of support. This is the question of, can I track this dollar to this exact intervention, to this exact outcome? This is the constant work of education research and of continuous progress monitoring. And the nature of some of the interventions make it very difficult for researchers in the United States for us to be able to say this exact dollar resulted in this outcome. We can do additional analysis with regression models and other sort of research methodologies. But I think what we would want to emphasize, again, is that we have in some cases, the interventions are very difficult to be able to linearly track from the funding source, what was actually accomplished, and then the fidelity. So you mentioned tutoring. You can say you're tutoring a student, but if you're not doing it to the evidence-based research model of tutoring, there will be no effect.
I think you just made my point, but you're not requiring the school district to report to have a specific plan that says our objective is to, based on evidence, to reach and help recovery with the following student vulnerable populations that we're targeting in our district with this following type of evidence-based intervention, to allow you to say, well, wait a minute, that's not a strong evidence-based intervention for that population. You should use, for bilingual education, students lost time, what is the most effective intervention? Some districts may say, well, we increased support, MTSS, for kindergarten through second grade for reading. Well, that's great. That's a strong intervention for reading, but does it serve this population at all?
Yeah. If you'll allow me a follow-up on that, of the multiple progress monitoring systems that Dr. Kame just mentioned, she mentioned the comprehensive program review, and you just used the example of bilingual education. That is both a federal and state program, so Title III, and then the Transitional Bilingual Instructional Program. The plans, in addition to the recovery plan that was submitted, that they submit yearly for the use of those funds, that's exactly where that progress monitoring happens. And staff at OSPI engage in approving the intervention or giving technical assistance when something is suggested by a district that does not have an evidence base. Those are existing mechanisms that we've been using throughout the pandemic that go into very specific programs at a level of granularity by student, by needs assessment of student needs at the district level. So in our response about the multiple progress monitoring systems, I just wanted to use that as an example to answer your question. Those types of decisions locally made with needs assessment data for the very specific both programs like multilingual students, students with disabilities, and for students of color, students experiencing poverty, exist in the comprehensive program review. So for example, also under Title I and the Learning Assistance Program, that is another element that is continuously monitored. There's a needs assessment, there's required actions, and a very rigorous process of monitoring among all programs, along with what was submitted, and then the annual updates submitted in data on the recovery plans. So again, to restate those, along with the revenue and expenditure plans, we have the comprehensive education and data CEDAR system for student data, including absences and other outcomes, the state report card, and we just released the Washington State School Improvement Framework, which is required under federal law and state law. That framework identifies students who are in the gap by both poverty, race, special education, multilingual, and I'm forgetting one.
Students with disabilities.
Oh, excuse me, students with disabilities. So all of those schools who have been identified now are in a 3-year cycle of improvement with additional support and funds as well. So if they fail to make progress, and in all those progress monitoring systems, they've been identified, now we work again with providing additional support in our role as the state education agency.
Well, thank you for going into detail in response for me. We have 2 questions. And first is Senator Wagner, and then Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the JLARC staff for a really excellent presentation. The learning loss is striking and obvious, and the racial disparity is striking and obvious. But if you're looking for evidence-based methodologies to help fix this, maybe we should look at the group who's doing the best. So unless we believe that Asian students are just naturally gifted, has OSPI looked at what's going on in that demographic, what's going on in the homes? Because it seems to me that whatever's happening in those households is at least as important as what's happening in our schools. And maybe it's something we should be studying and figuring out, although I will admit, cultural differences are hard to import into other populations, but maybe we should look at that. That's evidence-based success. How did they get there? Has OSPI thought about studying that and how we emulate it across all of our students?
So we have done some analyses with the assessments. The fall assessment was more challenging because it was a shorter test and it was given at a time of year we typically don't administer the test. So there were a number of caveats with that. We did have the spring 22 tests and spring 23 tests are currently going on. We did do some analyses with respect to the distribution of scores and the levels of performance and where we typically saw, so the top 10th percentile or the lowest 10th percentile of the assessment scores, and we looked at that across that. And I think that the distributions and the results that we see with respect to race and ethnicity were intertwined with that, so that the outcomes for students who are Asian may have been attributed in part to where they were pre-pandemic, and the often higher performance or higher scoring there. So we have done some of those analyses, and we will continue when we have the spring 23 assessments.
Yeah, and I would just add, now that this year, all the completed disaggregated race and ethnicity data that was required under fourth engrossed Substitute House Bill 1541, we now have the disaggregated categories, the subracial and subethnic, under the federal categories. And in our analysis of Asian, the Asian category, for example, and this analysis was also prompted by the Commission on Asian and Pacific and American Affairs, who's a key partner with us. When you disaggregate the data, not all Asian students are doing well. Asian students who are Southeast Asian, so as we look at the data, Vietnamese and some of those others, are not doing as well. Pacific Islanders has already been disaggregated. So there's an opportunity gap even within the federal race category of Asian. And that's exactly why that bill and those changes were put into place to disaggregate the data, because otherwise you would assume that all Asian students in the state of Washington are doing just fine and outperforming their peers, and they are not. There are students within that federal category. I'd also note that the Department of Education and the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level is right now doing rulemaking about adding disaggregated categories to all collections. And they are modeling and have looked at our state for the way that we have disaggregated the data, and we've given comment to support those changes. So this would affect all data collections. Those 7 federal race categories would now, and if this goes through, include all disaggregated categories.
Well, I am less interested in desegregating categories than I am in finding out what's working in the successful homes with successful students. I just think that's something we ought to look at. We have some groups who are doing much, much better, whether they're desegregated all together, they're still doing much better on the whole. Is OSPI going to take a look at what's going on in those homes to try and get on a better path for all of our students? That's my point. And it doesn't require an answer, really.
No, I appreciate that. And I would just reframe that the term is disaggregate. And I think I would like to just state that all students of color have assets and come into the public school system with many things that help them succeed.
Thank you for adding that reminder. And I do believe that your data and the report shows that the strongest correlation is with income. Isn't that correct, regardless of race? And that there are some rather clear observations about the impact of income on not having as much learning loss.
Yes, and poverty status is not a proxy for race, and race is not a proxy for poverty. We have presented data through Results Washington to the governor before, where we disaggregated of students of color. For example, black students who are low income versus black students who are non-low income. And when you do that analysis, there are still opportunity gaps. And I think that education research and certainly OSPI understand that those opportunity gaps exist because of systemic racism.
Thank you. Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I asked originally what part of number 2 does OSPI concur or not concur with? So establishing the process to monitor the school districts. And I understand that it is hard to do because 74% of this is reported in other categories. So you're not going to be able to get some information there because it wasn't required to I guess, report back on this. So, you know, I mean, we've been talking about this for a while. When we have 1 in 3 kids that are not at grade level in English and in math, and as a state, our rating has gone from a very high level to very lower level and has been declining since 2013. We all know that it is our paramount duty of the state to get the children a good education. So I am concerned that we need to be monitoring how are you going to move forward, because this isn't just a COVID thing now. The kids lost a lot during COVID. They're not going to get it back, but we need to do what we can to help them along. So because we all know that if you don't learn how to read until before third grade, it'll affect you for the rest of your life. So this is very concerning to me, and it's very disappointing, you know, how, I mean, COVID affected our kids in all ways and all manners, and we know that. And, you know, anxiety is up, and it indicated drug use was down. Maybe that's because they were home. I don't know. But it's very concerning. So how is it that you're going to be, what part of number 2, do you agree should happen, and how?
So I want to make sure that I understand your question and that I'm able to respond accurately. I think that on the partially concur, what we said in the preliminary hearing and that Superintendent Regdahl submitted in the response letter, we maintain that we have multiple systems in place that for reporting not just expenditures, outcomes, and I can restate them. Those monitoring systems exist. They've always existed, and we continue to rely on them, and we use them to be involved in processes like I just mentioned, like the Washington School Improvement Framework, which is through federal and state law to identify when there are gaps, target interventions and additional supports and technical assistance. I think that so that is the part where we believe that we have systems in place. I think the part where the superintendent was able to say that we would add additional monitoring systems is if, in addition to the multiple layers we have, if there was more monitoring required by the Department of Education. One note that I had put in here is that we submitted, as part of ESSER, a very long document that was also submitted with the letter returned in, which was Washington State's plan for ESSER funds, and that was approved by the Department of Education. So right now, according to the Department of Education, we are monitoring to their standard. We are doing everything explicitly as they have asked. We have closed out ESSER 1 and ESSER 2. There was 3 phases of funding that were put into place, and we will continue to work with the Department of Ed if there's additional analysis or additional reporting that they want. And I will just add as a personal note also, Senator Wilson, I really appreciate your passion, and you brought this up before. And again, the recovery graphs that were shared by JLARC staff, we see that as promising, and every educator in Washington State is working to close those gaps right now. And we believe that the next 2 years of data are going to show significant progress.
Thank you. With that, need to close out our discussion and ask if someone would like to move for adoption of distribution of the final report.
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve for distribution the proposed final report, Racial Equity Effects of Restricting In-Person Education During the COVID-19 Pandemic.
Distribution has been moved, and I heard a second. Any further discussion of the motion in front of us? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed to adoption of the report? Not hearing any. Anyone abstaining from adoption of the report? The report on racial equity effects of restricting in-person education during COVID-19 has been adopted for distribution. Thank you all very much, and thank you to both the JLARC staff and the entire team at OSPI for your support. With that, let's now turn to hybrid electric ferries, design, build, contracting, and procurement. Rebecca and Eric.
I'm afraid it will just be Rebecca today.
Rebecca, please, will you sail us away?
Keep things afloat? Sure.
Well done.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm Rebecca Connolly, and I am staff to this committee. You may recall that in February, we issued our preliminary report for the review of State Ferry's approach to design, build, contracting, and procurement. And today I am presenting the proposed final, in which the legislative auditor concluded that the legislature should consider revisions to statute to allow alternatives that can increase the speed of ferry acquisitions and the value to the state, and that the WashDOT Ferries Division should improve its cost estimating, payment, and other practices. So I'm going to start with just a bit of background. Ferries has issued plans to increase the fleet and shift from diesel to plug-in hybrid electric vessels. The first planned procurement is for hybrid electric Olympic class vessels. Olympic class ferries are the newest design in the fleet, and they have a 144 car capacity. Ferries tried to acquire 5 of these vessels by extending an existing contract, as was allowed by state law. However, negotiations were unsuccessful, and Ferries is now planning to issue a new RFP sometime this year. So the 2022 legislature directed us to evaluate Ferries policies and practices. That includes assessing opportunities to decrease costs and look for operational efficiencies. We hired a marine engineering and procurement firm to assist us in the evaluation, and we also hired a second firm to review their work. Now, given the technical nature of this study, we asked Ferries staff to review the consultant's work throughout the project. So in 2022, that involved multiple meetings, the review of 3 interim reports, and the consultant's final report. Matt Von Ruden from State Ferries is with us via Zoom today, and I'd just like to take a moment to thank him and his team for their diligence in reviewing all of the consultant's work for accuracy throughout the year. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we presented our preliminary report in February, and that report had 2 recommendations to the legislature. Since then, the legislature passed HB 1846, and that implemented our recommendations regarding best value selection and changes to the procurement process as they relate to the Olympic class ferry procurement. So with that in mind, I'll focus the presentation today on ferries. Our report had 5 recommendations to state ferries. These address cost estimates, cost risk, life cycle cost, payment strategy, and documentation. I'll go into these more at the end, but for now, we'll just note that Ferries concurs with these recommendations, and now I'll talk about what we found. So starting with cost estimating, best practices call for refining cost estimates as a project progresses, and Ferries is using standard methods to do that. So, for example, at the beginning of a project, they are using top-down estimates. It's a method commonly known as parametric estimating that basically uses the cost of historic vessels to estimate the cost of similar new vessels. As the project moves along and more information is known about the design and the type of ship, they move to bottom-up estimates, which are more refined and focused on individual line items. However, the estimates that Ferries is producing publicly often lack some key information. So they're using the standard estimates, but not documenting them when they're going public. For example, the estimate for the cost of a ferry has grown over the last 4 years, but the estimates that are shown often lack information about what caused the change. For example, how much is caused by inflation versus changes in the design. They don't know what's included in the estimate, what data or methods were used, or if there are outstanding risks or uncertainties that could cause the cost to change as the project moves forward. This lack of documentation can cause confusion, and it's contrary to best practice. We should also note that Ferries estimates are single points. So say a ferry is going to cost about $200 million. A single point doesn't adequately convey the risk and uncertainty around cost changes. A better approach is to offer a range of possible costs using a probabilistic approach to the estimate. And that would allow decision makers to set budgets based on the likelihood that the costs will be at or below a certain amount. For example, in this graph, that would be at or below this 60%, or there's a 60% likelihood that the cost is at that level. Ferries' parent agency, WashDOT, already uses probabilistic approaches for civil engineering projects valued over $100 million. So moving from the purchasing cost, not upfront cost, to life cycle costs, logically, as a project moves from those early design phases through construction and to operations, it becomes more complete. But at the same time, shown in this yellow line, your influence over costs decreases. And the best opportunities to control costs occur early in the project when the technical and contractual requirements are being established. After construction begins here, you have fewer opportunities to reduce those long-term operating costs. And this is critical because GAO has estimated that 70% of a vessel's life cycle costs are experienced after construction. That can be even greater for vessels like a ferry that have a 50 to 60-year lifespan. So pre-design studies can look at vessel requirements and their potential costs. For the Olympic-class vessels, ferries completed multiple pre-design studies, and they chose the topics for these studies based on stakeholder feedback and industry trends. Our consultant noted that all of the topics were appropriate, but a more systematic approach could have ensured that the studies address all of the potential life cycle cost drivers. It could also help ferries ensure that its pre-design studies address all statutory requirements. Ferry's approach to paying shipbuilders was also a question for us. Recent contracts indicate that they have paid shipbuilders based on estimated progress, and Ferries reported that this approach is administratively simple and helps the shipbuilder pay its subcontractors and suppliers. Best practice, however, is to tie payments to significant milestones, such as final design review, steel cutting, or sea trials, or to measurable progress. And progress-based approaches include earned value management, which is the standard for both the federal government and private shipbuilders. Finally, we'll just talk about their documentation. Ferry's primary policy document is the Vessel Engineering Manual. It has not been substantively updated since 2002. So although State Ferries complied with the laws that were in place, its official policies and procedures don't reflect state law, including changes made in 2015. Without those policies, Ferries relies heavily on staff expertise and consultants, and this can leave the agency vulnerable if it experiences retirements or turnover. As I mentioned at the beginning, House Bill 1846 was passed this session. That bill allows ferries to use different approaches for purchasing the hybrid electric Olympic-class ferries, but doesn't change the underlying design build laws that are specific to state ferries. So just want to note that updating the policies and procedures remains an important point for ferries as they move forward. And this brings us to the 5 legislative auditor recommendations: that ferries should ensure its cost estimates are clear and well documented, that apply probabilistic approaches, that it ensure its pre-design studies address life cycle cost drivers, that it tie the payments to milestones and progress, and that it update its policies and procedures. Ferries concurs with these recommendations, and OFM had no response. Our full report is available online, including the full consultant's report. Our contact information is here. I'm happy to take any questions, and as I noted before, Matt Von Ruden is also available by Zoom.
Thank you very much for a great report. Transportation Chair Phi, did you have a comment or question?
Well, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's one of those rare opportunities where things really work out from a timing standpoint, and it was very, since we did need to modify the way in which we procure ferries, this legislative session to put things back on, maybe perhaps on a new track towards success. It's very appreciative of the work that was done and the expertise that was brought to bear by the consultants you hired so that we could use that as we crafted legislation this session. Hopefully, the governor's going to sign the bill and we'll be to start moving forward with the procurement of 5 vessels. But thank you very much for your work. It's very greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Does that imply that there is a model for having JLARC reports actually changing outcomes in the legislative process?
As things are moving through the legislative process, yes.
Thank you. I'd like to ask if WashDOT's representative would like to come up, or are you online?
Hey, good morning, Chair Pollitt and members of the committee. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Matt Von Ruden. I am the System Electrification Program Administrator at Washington State Ferries. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on the recent JLARC report concerning the procurement of hybrid electric ferries on behalf of the department. In my role of Program Administrator, I'm responsible for directing and overseeing a portfolio of projects that together will transform the nation's largest ferry system to green hybrid electric propulsion. Guided by RCWs and Governor's executive order, the department developed a system electrification plan that, if followed, will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 76% from the 2005 baseline by the year 2040. The cornerstone of this program is the hybrid electric Olympic class ferry program, subject to this audit. I've been working with the JLARC audit team since July of 2021 to review Washington State Ferries policies and procedures related to the new vessel procurement. I would like to start by thanking the members of the audit team, Rebecca Conley, Eric Whitaker, and their consultants from Bard Marine for their efforts. The professionalism, diligence, and cooperation throughout the process are very much appreciated and reflect well upon the committee and the staff. I especially want to thank the team for accelerating the delivery of the report so that it could be considered during the recent legislative session. The findings positively contributed to the drafting of Engrossed House Bill 1846, which would provide added flexibility to the department to move forward and with the procurement of new hybrid electric ferries in a timely and efficient manner. I appreciate that the audit found that WashDOT's vessel procurement approach and practices in previous vessel acquisitions complied with statutory requirements in place at the time. I also welcome the recommendations for improvement. WashDOT concurs with each of the 5 recommendations, and we are actively working to implement them in our ongoing ferry procurement activities. These recommendations include improving and documenting new vessel cost estimates, consistent application of probabilistic approach to cost estimating, assessing opportunities for reducing vessel life cycle costs through pre-design studies, tying shipbuilder payments to significant milestones and measurable project progress, and updating our ferry acquisition policies and procedures to reflect current law and industry best practices. The details of our planned implementation are included in our written response dated 11 April. I'd be happy to elaborate on this response or address any other questions from the committee. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you for those comments about our staff as well. Are there any questions or comments for either Mr. Von Ruden or JLARC's team? Thank you. In that case, would a committee member like to make a motion to approve for distribution the report?
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve for distribution the proposed final report, hybrid electric ferries, design, build, contracting, and procurement.
Has been moved and seconded by Representative Fye. And any discussion of the motion for approval? Not seeing any discussion. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Anyone opposed to approving the report? Anyone abstaining on this topic? Thank you. The report is approved unanimously. Our next item is discussion of 2 proposed study questions. And so we've got the H-2A Temporary Farm Worker Program. Jill Satran is presenting, and that'll be followed by Paid Family and Medical Leave with Zach Freeman.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Paulette and members of the committee. My name is Jill Satran. I am serving as the lead analyst on the JLARC H-2A Farm Worker Visa Program Performance Audit. Unlike the previous presentations you've just heard about, which focused on study results, we are still very much in the early stages of our study, and I'm here today to present the proposed study questions for this effort. You may recall that in the 2022 supplemental budget, the legislature directed JLARC to assess the Employment Security Department's administration of the H-2A Farm Worker Program here in Washington. That same proviso also directed JLARC to complete 2 other farm worker wage and safety related performance audits, which you will hear about in future meetings. To give you just some high-level background on the H-2A program, under the H-2A program, agricultural employers may seek federal approval to bring in temporary foreign farm workers if they anticipate a shortage of U.S. farm workers to perform the labor. At the federal level, the U.S. Department of Labor is responsible for labor certification, and they also regulate H-2A employment once workers are here in the United States. The Employment Security Department supports the Department of Labor's H-2A responsibilities here in Washington. So at the state level, ESD has 3 kind of big buckets of responsibilities around the H-2A program. The first is the processing of employer job orders, also known as H-2A applications. As I mentioned, this program is designed to fill a labor gap when there are insufficient numbers of U.S. farm workers to complete the work to be done. An initial step for an employer is to recruit for U.S. workers to fill those jobs before they seek foreign farm workers. Because U.S. workers must be offered the same or better wages and benefits, ESD reviews the applications that are coming in from employers for compliance with H-2A requirements. ESD also works with employers to recruit U.S. workers using the WorkSource offices located throughout the state. ESD also coordinates with the Departments of Health and Labor and Industries to certify temporary worker housing, and they also conduct prevailing wage and prevailing practices surveys. The second major set of activities that ESD is active in for H-2A is compliance monitoring. Their compliance teams work with farm workers to hear their complaints and to process their complaints. If needed, they will refer those on to enforcement agencies if enforcement is required. They also work with employers on compliance with H-2A requirements. The final area of set of responsibilities is around outreach and training. So their team, the ESD team, will go out and do site visits, working with both employers and farm workers to make sure they understand their rights and responsibilities under the H-2A program. They also coordinate with other state agencies who have responsibilities around farm worker safety kinds of issues. This study is designed to address 6 questions. Does ESD administer the H-2A program in compliance with state and federal laws and policies? How does ESD recruit U.S. farm workers for H-2A positions here in Washington? Do ESD's activities help to increase employer compliance or worker awareness of their rights and responsibilities? Does ESD effectively coordinate with other state agencies? What approaches does ESD use to provide culturally appropriate and responsive interactions with foreign and U.S. farm workers? And how does ESD's H-2A administration compare with other states? Because this audit focuses specifically on ESD's administration of their responsibilities under the H-2A program, we will not be evaluating underlying federal H-2A programs and policies. So in terms of next steps, you should expect to hear the preliminary report in January, at the January meeting in 2024, and we will be providing the proposed final report in April of 2024. We have provided our contact information. Thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions.
Do we have any questions for Bill? Any questions? I want to thank Jill and the team for, I've had some extensive interactions with you about the racial equity analysis, and I really appreciate the work. We're breaking new ground here, and there are very clear implications for racial equity in terms of the H-2A program, and I feel very confident that those will be addressed. And it's important for us to continue the work with stakeholders to make sure that they're comfortable with that. So thank you for that. Not seeing any other questions. Okay, then our next proposed study question is, thank you, Jill, is paid family and medical leave. Zach, come on down. Talk about farm workers. Oh, I didn't even get it. You should just share that. Representative Orcutt would like to emphasize that I, on the farm worker study, talked about breaking new ground. I didn't even realize it. Zach, do better.
I'll try my best. Good morning, Chair Paulette, members of the committee. My name is Zach Freeman, staff to JLARC. I'm presenting our proposed study questions for our review of the state's paid family and medical leave program. The paid family medical leave program offers paid leave to public and private employees. Eligible employees can take up to 12 weeks of paid family or medical leave to recover from a serious health condition, care for a family member, bond with a new baby or child, or to take military family leave. The program is funded by employee and employer contributions, and it is administered by the Employment Security Department, or ESD. The premium formula is set in statute, and employers with 50 or more employees are required to pay a share of those premiums. The 2022 legislature mandated multiple reviews of the paid family and medical leave program. There was a report by OFM and Milliman that came out at the end of 2022 that reviewed the premium formula, and that was followed by a legislative task force that reviewed the OFM and Milliman report and also recommended changes to the premium formula, which were adopted through legislation this past session. And finally, the legislature directed JLARC to review ESD's implementation of the paid family and medical leave program. So our study will address 3 questions. First, are ESD's program administration and organizational structure consistent with statute and best practices? And within this first question, we do have a few sub-questions, including, does ESD process applications in a timely, systematic, and equitable manner? To what extent does program participation or experience vary by race or ethnicity? How does ESD monitor and assess employer and employee compliance with requirements? Second, does ESD prepare and report financial information in accordance with best practices? And finally, does the paid family premium rate formula produce rates that meet statutory requirements? And as I mentioned, that formula did change this past session. We will present our briefing report in September of this year, followed by the preliminary report in October of 2024. The study team's contact information is here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Zach. Do we have any questions? With both of these reports, committee members should feel free to contact the staff leads with input or questions. Really want to encourage that. They're totally open, and it's a great process. So thank you very much for presenting. I'm not seeing any questions or comments. With that, I'm quite surprised that we are 10 minutes ahead of schedule when I thought that we would be behind. Is there any good of the order that anyone have? I want to share with you that the JLARC Executive Committee met this morning. Representative Orcutt, Senators Wilson and Mullet, and we will be presenting in July some revisions to the work plan of the JLARC. That includes how to accommodate some of the very big studies that the legislature asked us to perform, and also some studies that we've had under discussion that have been on our agenda, but which the executive committee has been running trap lines about whether or not longstanding mandates are out of date for those studies or expectations. For example, one on the effect of tuition increases on access when that was adopted in the era of higher ed institutions having authority just to set tuition levels, and now the legislature does. So there are several that we'll be proposing changing, and as well as how to accommodate new ones. We'll present that in the revised work plan. And if any committee members are interested in that, please contact those of us on the executive committee or contact Eric. This afternoon at 1 o'clock, the Performance Audits I-900 Subcommittee will be back here in this room at 1 o'clock to hear the State Auditor's Office presentation of their performance audit on opportunities to improve improve school safety planning, and which is a follow-up to 2019 report. Is a very important topic, and hope that people will rejoin us either online or in person at 1 p.m. right here on the same location, but I think there is a separate Zoom link for the I-900. There is a separate link, so look at your email for a different link if you're joining us by Zoom. Any other good of the order? Eric, anything? With that, I am going to conclude today's JLARC meeting and thank all the people who presented, both the JLARC staff as well as the agency representatives. Thank you all very, very much. We are concluded.